consciousness is infinite, is eternal, has the core qualities of love, creativity, and it has intelligence. And it has contained within it all it is and never has been. So the conversation that we are having now will be retained within that infinite and eternal consciousness. And as embodied beings in the present, we have got all the experience of every human being, who knows what other experience, by the way, beyond this particular planetary one, but it is contained there within consciousness for us to draw on.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. We try to get people to think about things, here. It's like synchronicity is a gateway to a lot of ideas, ideas that are becoming more and more important for humanity these days. And one of the links, an important link between synchronicity and some of these important things, is the question of consciousness. A lot of people use the word consciousness. It's still ethereal in the way it's being defined, but we're getting better at it. And our guest today is able to tell us that she is a consciousness researcher, that she studies consciousness in a way that allows people to understand it. And we need consciousness teachers, and she is one. And today we will link consciousness and synchronicity, because she's a serial synchronicity person. I haven't heard that term yet. I call them coinciders, people who experience a lot of them. But she's a serial. It happens all the time, and one thing after another. So we'll hear some of Joan Walton's coincidences, and we'll link that up today with consciousness, and particularly her passion these days with educating people about consciousness. So I'll introduce Joan, and she'll tell us a story or two.
Thank you, Bernie.
You're welcome, Joan. And here I go talking about you again. Dr. Joan Walton is a researcher in consciousness and education at York St. John University in the UK, chair of the board of directors of the Scientific and Medical Network, of which I am also a member, and a member of the very important Galileo Commission Steering Group that puts together remarkable conferences online about important subjects, including synchronicity. In these roles, she has a specific interest in integrating science, consciousness, and spirituality. She has throughout her life an interest in the phenomenon of consciousness, and I'll say the phenomena of consciousness, influenced by the work of Carl Jung, and has with colleagues created a global consciousness educators network. Get that? A consciousness educators network, global. She collaboratively inquires into different ways of exploring perceptions of consciousness. We each have our own little ways of looking at it. She is a serial synchronicity experiencer. Welcome, Joan, to Connecting with Coincidence.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to see you again. We were together in a car driving into Charlottesville not too long ago, having a lovely conversation, and this will be a continuation of that. So why don't you tell us a synchronicity story, and as we go, we're going to be linking up your synchronicity stories with consciousness and a consciousness education.
Okay. Well, I guess when you start talking about synchronicity stories, the question is where to start and or which one to tell. and very often they're linked. There might be a lot of minor ones that are linked, but I'll start with one that kind of stands on its own. And I know you've interviewed Todd Bureau recently, and you said before we started that there seemed to be a lot of synchronicities attached to him. So I'll tell one that includes him, and this goes back to I think it'll be 2 years last Christmas, and it was just before Christmas, and I was in my home here, and my two grandchildren live round the corner from me, and they were getting ready for Christmas, and I had been there and helping them put decorations up, etc. And I took some photographs of them, and then I came round to my house because I said that there was a program that I thought they should watch, the Snowman, the film Snowman by Raymond Briggs, which I just think is a classic Christmas film, and Esme and Kezia had not seen it. So I said, I'll go round ahead of you, and then you can come round to watch it. So it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon in UK time. So I left around 3:30, and I walked round to the house, and I put the TV on, made sure it was on the right channel, and in the meantime, I sent a text to Todd and just attached a couple of photographs of the girls in the message, and just saying what they were like at what they were doing in preparation for Christmas. And he sent back a message which said, "Oh, nice photo. It looks just like the kind of closing scenes of It's a Wonderful Life." So The Wonderful Life, most people will probably know, is a kind of an old black and white film that's often shown. And at that moment, I looked at the screen on my TV, and it was showing the last 10 minutes of It's a Wonderful Life. They were showing the film before, The Wonderful Life, before the snowman came on the screen. So at the time that he had just mentioned that this photograph reminded him of this film, that exact film was showing in front of me on the screen. So I just took a screenshot of it, and thought that was just a remarkable. How did that come up? I can't remember when I last saw or heard of that film, or what actually brought that one into his mind. So that was a real synchronicity. Whether it was telepathy or what, I don't know, but it was just a kind of unexpected connection between two events.
Yeah, and I tend to look at probabilities first. And the idea of It's a Wonderful Life is a movie usually played around Christmas. It's made, and here they were playing it, and you were playing another Christmas movie for the grandchildren. So the probability of that movie being done, it was higher at that time. And for Todd to bring it up again around that time, but still, it's the timing that makes the difference. It happened right as he says it. I was talking to a friend of mine, and TV was going on yesterday, and he says marvelous, and I see Marvel comics on the screen, and it just makes me laugh. So these are funny things that are probably more common than we recognize. So let's say that happens, uh, and it does happen, and that probability can have some play in that. That is the Christmas kinds of movies for what you described. Tell us another one that seems a little bit more outlandish than that one.
Okay, well, I'll tell you the one that I've actually spoken about. I was avoiding it because people who've heard me might have heard it before, but this is probably the one that had a very powerful effect on me. So I'm going back in time then to when my daughter was about 6 years of age, and we were going on holiday. We lived in the Midlands part of the UK, and we were going on holiday to France, and we were taking with us, we had a caravan, so we were taking the caravan over to stay on a campsite in France. And we were meeting up with friends there, and it was a time we didn't have any money. We were just trying to do holidays as cheaply as possible. My friends didn't have very much money, but we had an old tent, which was about secondhand to us, about 20 years old, but it was a big kind of 6-berth blue and orange tent, which we put in the caravan and we were carrying with us so that our friends with their 2 kids could use that. So we left off very early in the morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, and then we got to the southwest of England shortly before we crossed the Channel to France, and we stopped in the lay-by to have some breakfast. And so that we could have room in the caravan to have breakfast, Howard, my husband at that point, took the tent out and put it underneath, just stored it underneath the caravan for the time being, so that we could have the caravan free for breakfast. So we're getting the breakfast out, and I noticed Rachel, my daughter, at the back of the caravan looking out. So I went to see what she was looking at. She was obviously very curious, and saw that this white van had drawn up behind us, and there were some young men there, and one of the young men was at this curbside just relieving himself at the side. So I pulled Rachel away and closed the curtain and said, Rachel, don't watch them, come and have breakfast, etc., etc. So after we finished and we're about to go again, we went out to take the tent back into the caravan, and it wasn't there. It had gone. So it seemed quite clear that the young men had taken the tent and basically stolen it, and we had to leave without it. So we're really concerned about this because, you know, as I say, our friends were dependent on it, and we didn't know what we could do. We didn't have the money to buy a new one, and we drove across the Channel really kind of wondering, how are we going to do anything about this, and what can our friends do to stay, because our caravan was just very small and there was no way that 4 adults and 3 children would be able to live in that. And then we got to the campsite and drove up to reception, and I just said, not really expecting any answer, but just said to the woman in pretty bad French, do you by any chance have a tent? We've lost our tent, and do you know anywhere we might buy a second-hand one or get a second-hand one or something? And she just gave me a very strange look, and then went to the back and came back with this tent and said, well, this doesn't really happen, but yesterday morning, sorry, this man came with this tent and said, you know, we don't have use of this. We've just used that. We're not going to need it anymore. We're getting a new tent. So please have it. And if anybody has need of it, then you can give it to them. So that in itself would have been a big enough coincidence. But what was the really impacting factor was that when we put it up, it was virtually identical to the tent that we had. It was about, you know, the same kind of age. It was a blue and orange one. It had kind of various tears in it at different places. And I honestly would have thought that it was the identical tent, that actually it was our tent being returned, except the tears and the little rips, the tiny rips and the holes were at different places. So we knew that it was a different tent, but to all intents and purposes, it was exactly the same one. And that made an enormous impact on me. I just felt that went way beyond the bounds of the kind of coincidence you're talking about. And I remember just walking away on my own and saying to myself very consciously, Joan, if ever you doubt that there's a power in this universe, if you ever have any doubt about the fact that there being a power behind who we are and what we do in this universe, just remember this occasion, because this really does mean something beyond the coincidental.
I don't know if you noticed, but you used the word intent in your description. No intent or purpose. And that's part of the fun of this, being able to see how we overlap our phrases and the language. So here both of these are timing the wonderful life, which is an important thing to see the metaphor in that. It's a Wonderful Life. Grandchildren, connection with Todd. You're a good friend and a guy I know pretty well now. And then the day before, somebody drops the tent off with only the intent that somebody might use it, because he didn't he didn't have a purpose for it anymore. He's going to get a new one. And that was the day before. And you did the strange, wonderful thing, which is you asked. And in order for a lot of these coincidences to happen, you have to ask. It's a funny thing about asking. Uh, People do prayers with asking in them. They ask questions. A good student asks questions of the teacher. It's important to not feel stupid when you ask questions of someone when you don't know something. But this question asking thing has expanded so much into what we call now prompts on an artificial intelligence. It's how you ask the question. It's what questions you ask that very much determine the kind of response you get. So it's like AI is exploding that which you just did while driving into the campground. You asked and you received. I think there's a well-known phrase, ask and you shall receive. And that's not always true. It is a good way to increase the probability of getting something to happen that you need to have happen. And that's what you did. So how does the tent and the timing with the tent that you needed and the enjoyment of connecting with our friend Todd through a movie that he just mentioned to you, then being shown on the television. What do they tell us? What do they tell you about consciousness and you're educating people about consciousness?
I mean, I think an important thing in this also, I mean, so you say you've asked the question, but there's got to also be the preparedness of the listener or the people involved to be open to possibilities other than it's just coincidence. I mean, you say, well, there was a good chance of the wonderful life, but remember at the time that I'm talking about with Todd, in his world, it was kind of 10 o'clock in the morning with bright sun and not necessarily the whole Christmas spirit that we had. It was many hours apart, and I can see no reason why that film should be on his mind at that point in time. There's something about the photographs of the girl reminded him of something in that film. So I think I feel less sure that it could just be explained by
I'm not
kind of coincidence. But
I'm not saying that it probability fully explains at all. I'm
okay,
saying it's a variable to keep in mind.
yeah,
It it's very to me for me, not necessarily for you, but for me, it's important to judge the probability of something happening. It doesn't mean that there's nothing else going on at all. It
yeah.
just
No,
means
that's
it.
fine.
Okay, so we got that straight. Now
Yeah.
I'm,
So I
it's
was
just
talking about the openness of somebody. So, for example, my very first meeting, I'm going to give you a time where someone is not open to that, and hence these things probably happen less so often. My first meeting with someone who actually then became my work partner, actually, but we were just came by chance to be sitting opposite each other in a canal boat in a bigger social occasion. And he was just asking me about myself. We'd not spoken before, and for some reason, I started talking about synchronicities. I don't know how I did, probably to do with, I think I was a member of the Scientific and Medical Network, and there was probably some event that had raised that, but that came into the conversation. And so at some point, he said, it's very interesting. I said, has something like that ever happened to you? He said, well, he said, he was a twin. He had a twin brother, and his brother lived in America. And there was this one day when suddenly Ian, who was the person I was on the boat with, suddenly felt this sharp pain in his leg, and he just couldn't understand it. He was kind of hobbling around, and it was very painful, but there was no definite reason for it. And that later on, he was on the phone to his mother, and he said, "I've just got this unaccountable pain in my leg. I don't know what started it, but it doesn't seem to be going." And she told him, she said, "Oh, I've heard from Malcolm, and he's actually broken his leg." And it transpired that at the fact that his twin brother had broken his leg, uh, Ian began to feel the pain in his leg. And so that seemed to me to be just an undeniable connection. I don't even know if you call it synchronicity, something that associates the twin brothers. But he refused to accept that it was anything other than coincidence. I mean, he had a kind of fascination for these things, but he could never move beyond that that sense that it was just coincidence. And his mind was closed to exploring beyond that and what it could mean. He didn't really want to enter into that discussion. And my understanding of that from conversations with other people actually is that they have difficulty doing that because it means they're then going to have to question the beliefs that they've been brought up with, that somehow they sense there's something more. And I've had people say this explicitly to me. But if I were to open up that possibility, if I were to open up that there is something meaningful to these events, then it's going to cause, I'm going to have to question all that I've been brought up to believe. And I don't know that I can handle that questioning to my belief system. So they kind of close down on themselves. And hence, I think they close down on the possibility of these kind of events happening to them.
Can't emphasize more what you've just emphasized, that there's a rigidity to people's thinking, kind of an inertia of the mind, where people want to stay with what they already know. And it's a lot of work to get that inertia from standing still to moving on. And that would change a lot of the way they think about the world. And that's going on now as people get more fixed beliefs about political things. Even though the information is contradictory, they still want to hold on for the same reason that he wouldn't believe there's something else going on with his brother. What I'm hoping is that experiences like this twin pain feeling at the same time at a distance becomes known as simulpathity, the feeling of the pain of a loved one at a distance. It's very common among twins. Research in London, particularly about twins, has shown how twins can feel the other person's pain. New Zealand research, Am I One Body, is the title of this research. And the best way to remember that is one twin says about her brother, it's usually identical twins, but not always, says about her brother, I wish Max would take better care of himself because he's causing me a lot of pain. Because Max would get into trouble and she would, the other twin would feel it. These are not uncommon experiences. And once people like this twin you just described can see that other people are doing it, it's not just him, it's other people. This is a common human experience. And in fact, it used to be called telepathy. Uh, Telepathy, the old definition of telepathy, tele, at a distance, pathy, feeling, was feeling the pain of someone at a distance. So we've now talked about three examples: the tent, the movie, and now this twin. And it's important to be open to these things in order to pursue them. And part of what synchronicity does is being able to help people become more open to these new ideas. So tell us about how all of this and related things inform your education about consciousness, Joan, because we want to be able to educate people about consciousness. That's what you are dedicated to doing. So tell us the links between synchronicity consciousness and consciousness education.
Yeah, well, it's been a long journey, Bernie. It's which I'm still on, and so I've had this interest since my late teens, really. But I read Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, when I was 19, and of course that opened me up to both the idea of synchronicity and the ideas of the unconscious, and that took me into depth psychology and a very personal exploration of my own consciousness at quite some depth over the next few years. And I think once I say this all the time in our study of consciousness, for me, there's too much emphasis on consciousness as something out there. Let's have a theory of consciousness. You know, there's the kind of taxonomy of consciousness that looks at all the different possibilities. And I tend not to start with a theory. I've tended always to start with my own experience of consciousness. And that's all we all have, actually. That's all we all start with, is our experience of consciousness. And our theories emerge out of our experience of consciousness. So I just kind of have tried to stay true to that through my life, is evaluate everything in relation to my own experience. And so the journey has been a kind of exploring the relationship between that inner experience and what goes on when I explore that in some depth, and then connecting that with my understanding of the external world and why we're here and what we're doing here. And that's a kind of progressive, iterative process. I'm in my professional life a kind of an action researcher in terms of research, and action research is about integrating experience, reflecting on that experience, theorizing about it, and then looking at what we can do to improve it or change it or set it off in a particular direction. And in my academic life, it's about giving that kind of methodology credibility to support doctoral students on researching the relationship between their internal and external life within their professional practice and giving it credibility. So I've kind of lived my life, and what that means is, to me, it's led me to realize that consciousness is unlimited. So my ontological view of the world at the moment, to kind of go a long way forward in that journey, is that consciousness is infinite, is eternal, has the core qualities of love, creativity, and it has intelligence. And it has contained within it all it is and never has been. So the conversation that we are having now will be retained within that infinite and eternal consciousness. And as embodied beings in the present, we have got all the experience of every human being, all who knows what other experience, by the way, beyond this particular planetary one, but it is contained there within consciousness for us to draw on. And my explanation of synchronicity is reflects that of Carl Jung and the work that he did with Wolfgang Pauli. So I do absolutely see synchronicities as being a kind of coincidence of the psyche and the physical, and a kind of indication that the path you're on is an appropriate one, is an appropriate way forward, and it's just giving you an indication that you're going in the right direction. So it's given me over time consciousness, because that's what we all have in common, and we know so little about it, and we know so little about the possibilities, has become something of a passion of mine in terms of my interest. I do think and talk about this in different settings, and have been involved in collaborative inquiries with people along the way about this. One such inquiry was part of my own PhD research. I have realized that if people can address their reservations, which often I think are somewhat fear-based. I'm kind of a little bit fearful of moving forward in this kind of way, the temptation to stay more with the known. But if people can, if you like, fear the fear and do it anyway, and kind of have a certain amount of courage in exploring their own consciousness, in exploring that with others, then there is no limit to that journey. I kind of think that's the human journey we're on, is how we allow consciousness to live through us is one of the main principles of the consciousness education project that you've spoken about. So it's led me to the point that consciousness has been the interest of scientists and philosophers in the main. It's got science has got increasingly interested in consciousness. For most of that time, from a materialist perspective, they've been interested in looking at how the brain, assuming that the brain creates consciousness. But in recent years, it's been realized that there is absolutely no evidence at all to support the fact that the brain creates consciousness, and there is huge amounts of evidence that consciousness exists beyond the brain. Synchronicities being one of them, but out-of-body experiences, telepathy, near-death experiences, so much evidence there. So that once you accept the possibility that consciousness exists beyond the brain, then the question is, so how far does it expand and where does it take us? And if we are to follow that path, where does it lead us in this journey of what it means to be human? So the Consciousness Education Project was set up based on the assumption that we need to question the fact that the brain produces consciousness. So our definition of consciousness is an exploration of perspectives on the source and nature of consciousness and their implications for being and knowing, teaching and learning. And myself and Laurel Waterman, whom you know, and Marjorie Woolacott, whom you know, have been working together to establish this Consciousness Educators Network and to invite people to come and join us to look at how we can engage in collaborative inquiry about a response to these questions, the source and nature of consciousness. And it's taken us to working with some diverse groups around the world. We've got about 12 projects at the moment where individuals are working with groups of people to explore that question about the source and nature of consciousness in many, many different kind of settings.
If anyone is interested in following up, connecting with the Consciousness Education Network, the link will be in Joan's bio on the podcast. So you might want to be tuning into that. My question still is how you've gone from your own experience to an infinite sense of consciousness. And I'm a kind of incrementalist kind of guy. I say, you're leaping way out there, Joan, into the unus mundus of Jung, probably, or the Great Mother, as he first called it, the mother from which we all spring, the infinite mind-matter place where they're both part of the same thing. And that synchronicity tells us that mind and matter are much more connected than we had thought. And that's Pauli and Jung were getting to that. But I'm an in-between kind of guy. Is like, okay, from what I understand you saying and what I do is go from my own consciousness out, not as far as you go. I go out a little further and just see what's out here rather than way out there, even though you can't talk about this in terms of space and time because it gets beyond that, the way you're talking about it. But I think there is a space-time somewhat relevance to consciousness, and the consciousness that we start with I'd like to hear your comment on this. The consciousness we start with is our own ability to observe our own minds, which is I call our self-observer. That seems to me a bit of the consciousness from which we can expand further. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that relates, if I'm understanding you rightly, to what I've been talking about in relation to action research. Because in a sense, if I talk about action research and it starts from my own experience, so the question is, what am I experiencing now? So I pay
Yeah,
attention to that,
yeah,
and I'm aware that I'm aware, and I'm thinking
yeah,
about what I'm aware on. So that leads on to reflection. So my
yeah.
reflection raises a lot of questions, and then that goes into the theorizing. So I try and provide some explanations that might come from, conversations with you and other people. It might come from my reading. And it helps feed the questions that have arisen as a consequence of my experience and my reflections on it. And that whole process leads me on to a different understanding of myself, to a different, incremental. You talked about incremental, and I would
I
agree.
do.
This whole journey has been incremental for me, but I've now been doing this incremental journey for half a century. So there's a lot of increments you can cover in that amount of time, and I have to say that at various stages there have been, it seems to reach a plateau, and then something has happened, or there's been some kind of event or inner exploration, and there's a shift in consciousness, and I see the world in a different kind of way, and so I can see that there have been uh, different phases along the way. But that process of action research, that process I've gone through, I started in the 1970s. So it just becomes integral to me. So I'm kind of, constantly inquiring into my own experience and reflecting on that and drawing on sources of information, etc., to help me theorize and think through what the significance of that is.
Well, now you're talking what I can understand better because you've done incremental for teenage since teenager. A lot of people haven't done incremental, and I'm cautious. I can get out there, and I have, but maybe not as far as you have, but I'm incremental still and trying to be able to describe what that incrementalness is. And you alluded to it, Joan. I'm aware, but more importantly, I'm aware that I'm aware. And that awareness of being aware is fundamental to being able to go further into what consciousness might be. And I wonder if you might take us to that place that you go to so easily that you know you're aware. So that's no big deal anymore. But let's start with people who kind of know that they can observe their own minds because they do it, but then they don't know they're really doing that until they observe that they're observing their own minds. I call that observer of the observer, the second observer. There's a second observer that observes the primary observer operating on my own mind and looking at the minds of other people. And that developing that own personal self-observer is a fundamentally important part of all this, that you're able to observe your own mind enough so that you can observe your own mind in operation. So would you please stay with that part of your journey for a little while that might be helpful to people who haven't gotten to knowing, being aware that they're aware?
I think you might have to repeat that. I want to get the level right, Bernie, that you're at. Can you just repeat exactly what you're asking of me?
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just, as I say, I don't want to go off where you're trying to get to.
I get caught up in this stuff too. It's really fun. So I'm glad to try to do it more slowly. I can be talking with you now and watch what I'm thinking about before I say it. I can watch it as I'm saying it. I can see my emotions. I can feel my heart and be aware of my heart operating now. Okay. And I can feel my hands on my desk as I'm talking to you. I can hear the sound of my voice in the microphone in the earphones I have now. So I'm aware that I'm aware of these stimuli going through my mind. But then I can be aware that I'm aware of them. In fact, my description that I just did came from being aware that I was aware of the sensations going through me. So my awareness can be the feeling of knowing what's going on in my mind and my body, but then I can know that I'm aware of these feelings, experiences, sensations going through me. So I'm asking you about the first observer observing my own mind, and then the second observer observing my first observer observing observing the first observer, the second observer observing the first observer. That's what I thought I heard you say when you said you are aware of being aware.
Yeah. It's very difficult to put, I'm finding it very difficult to put myself in that situation. I mean, I can, I've talked to you about the kind of action research process, but I feel so much now, I just have to say, I feel so much now embedded in or an integral part of that infinity and eternity. And I'll tell you, when I first became aware of that, I was on a week-long meditation. It was a meditation teacher training week. I wasn't intending to be a meditation teacher. It's never been my intention. It's not my skill. But I wanted to explore very different kinds of meditation, and I was with a very good friend who does do meditation teacher training. So I was having involved in these lengthy meditation sessions of different kinds, and also in between times, and I would skip some of the sessions and go out into the Snowdonia Mountains and just enjoy the beauty of the mountains and the landscape and the wildness, etc. So on this particular day, I had been out running actually a little bit in the mountains, and I'd just gone to the top of one of these mountains and had what was really, I guess, a spiritual experience. I just felt at one with the universe and at one with God and in love with the universe and all of these kind of overwhelming experiences, and came back into the meditation at what was quite an extended one. And it was a guided visualization. And as the person leading this evolved it, he came towards the end and he was saying, expand out, and now imagine that you are connected within an infinite and eternal universe. And I just, at that moment, I just realized I'm there. That's where I live. That's how where I exist and what informs me. And I access, I seek, I listen to what is going on for me in that place all the time. Now, I'm not saying that have not always been there. There've been, times in this journey, so that's what the incremental, that was a shift that happened. I'm not quite sure when that shift happened, but it was a very kind of significant shift at one point in time prior to that. And I had not really been aware necessarily that shift had happened until that point in the meditation. But then being there and living in that place makes it kind of quite difficult for me to get into that space that I think you're asking me to get into, because I just feel now that whatever I'm asked or whatever I'm doing, I'm kind of drawing from what I experience to be an infinite, an eternal, and loving universe.
Oh, that's a wonderful response, Joan. I, hey, I'm way out there now. I'm part of the oneness. I can't get down to those little things you're talking about, Bernie. And we each have our different ways of doing this, of expanding our consciousness. My job is to be writing about this in an incremental way. Uh, and part of what I'm getting to in describing this to you, Joan, is a kind of a relatively new idea now in talking about consciousness. I call it the collective self-observer, that we have a collective mind that is connected and illustrated. The connections are illustrated by the twins who have their feeling of the other person being in pain, even the kind of thing where your friend Todd tells you something that appears on the TV screen, and even that a need you've had with the tent gets met. These are something about the interconnectedness of human minds that you are describing. The telepathy, particularly in its various forms, tends to tell us about. Uh, there are a lot of people with near-death experiences, as you're describing, get into where you are, where there's an infinite consciousness, and they live in that as well as live here and go back and forth with it. I'm at this incremental place where I think there is a group mind. There is a mind of humanity, the collective human mind, I call it. And this collective human mind has the capacity, hasn't developed it, but is beginning to, I think, to develop a collective self-observer that's made up of the collective observers of lots of people, like potentially you or others who recognize that they're aware of being aware and can be aware together as a as some kind of group of what's going on in the collective mind in a way that helps the collective mind make changes the same way this personal self-observer in psychotherapy and in other ways can help make changes in the patterns of the way people think and behave.
You know something, Bernie? I think you've just helped me realize something in a way that I possibly hadn't realized before, or put it in a different form. You started there saying that the incremental is important because you're writing a book, and then went on to talk about that. I have not written a book, or not a book like that. And people who've known me through my life have often questioned that, because I said many years ago, I've been on the point of writing a book. And I keep asking myself, why not? Because there's so much content in there and so much I want to write about and could write about. But it seems to me that it's always changing, that the book that I would write a month ago was different from the book I'd write now. And I think what I'm realizing is that I'm so intent on the journey of exploration. I'm so intent on that process, on you know, my experience and reflecting on that and thinking about it, and it keeps moving on. It's a kind of living theory, a living way of approaching life, and I'm still exploring it. I'm still exploring what it means, and I'm interested in bringing other people along, you know, along with me, which is why when people ask what I do, I'm an educator and I'm a facilitator. So what I'm doing in this consciousness education project with Laurel and Marjorie is encouraging other people to explore these kind of arenas as well, encouraging them to trust their intuition. So many people do understand there's more to their experience, there's more to consciousness, and they want to think about it more. So I'm so spending so much of my time engaged in those kind of processes that I haven't got to a stage where I feel I can write all this down in a book, because it keeps on moving. And I guess
Yeah.
what we've said between us, you want to slow it down and make it incremental. that's exactly what's needed to write a book, and that's not what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, and even as I write this, I see that it gets old by the time I finish it. There's more going on here, and I can't keep up with it. It's going to keep changing. It's what I see at the present. But even what you just said, Joan, means maybe not a book, but you have principles by which you are attempting to teach people. And one of them is called trust your intuition. Now, that is a complicated idea when you can't just, I mean, if you're educating people, you can't just say, oh, trust your intuition. I mean,
No.
what do we mean by intuition? It's a vast territory of stuff, some of which are relatively fixed, relatively, I say, things to be able to tune into. Like, what is your heart saying? What is your gut saying? What is the still small voice in your mind saying that your rationality is telling you to stay away from? Can you trust the voices you hear in your head? And a lot of people say, no, you can't because that means you're crazy. No, there's a lot of people who've done very well, Churchill being one of them, who listened to the voices in his head. And there's a whole history of people being able to listen to the voices in their heads. That's an aspect of intuition, which I think needs to be reinforced so people have confidence, but not just confidence, know which voices to listen to. So there's a kind of discrimination with intuition that's vitally necessary. So all I'm doing is wrapping here about, you say trust your intuition. There are some principles by which a person needs to learn how to trust their intuition, which are probably in your repertoire and probably fairly repetitious, unless I'm not right about that.
Did I actually use the phrase trust your intuition?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, you
So,
did.
okay, well, I'm going to slightly correct that then. It's not one I normally use because I think there's all kind of trip ups in that. The phrase I normally use is trust the process. And I actually see the nature of the process different to intuition, because I think intuition has all kinds of dangers in it. It can be informed by all kind of preconceptions and stuff. So I would amend that. Trust the process for me gets back into that a much more deeper inquiry into, okay, what am I feeling? What's going on here? Test it out, listen to others. So it's much more complex process involved than just very simply trusting your intuition, because so intuition is in there, is included, but there's other things around it to check it out and to make sure that what you're instinctively feeling is not being, perhaps adversely affected by some kind of preconditioning or previous experiences. So
Even trust the process is full of potential potholes. The process for
yeah,
me,
true,
the pro,
true.
it's
Well,
not that.
well,
Go ahead.
I think it's got to be a discernment. There's got to be discernment in there. So,
That's
because
all
I
I'm
say I
talking.
trust the universe as well. So there's discernment, and
It's
we need to work at what the
And
nature of that discernment
intuition
is.
and trusting the process, I have some overlap in the way I understand the terms. And what I'd like to get to one day so that we don't have to use words as much, but I can get a feeling for what you mean without having to put the words on it, because the words kind of condense things and we have different meanings to them, but still we need them. And the idea of trust the process still to me is a whole big thing, because I learned the phrase trust the process from psychotherapy, where you had to learn to trust the process between the patient and the therapist. And I didn't know what that meant. Trust is a big deal. Um, how do you trust? What is trust becomes important, because trust, it's not going to hurt me. It It might even help me, but you first got to see it's not going to hurt you. And then you got to discern when it's going to potentially hurt you. So discernment is very important with trust the
Yeah.
process. So you're on a very, very important journey, Joan. And the terms you're using, from my perspective, would, for me, not maybe any other people, because it's you're educating, need some clarification so that the people who are listening know this phrase, trust the process, which you now started to elaborate on. What does that mean? And that's got principles in it, discernment being fundamental. So
Yeah.
what's discernment? How do you discern? Um, that's this or no, good or bad. Testing it out is, I think, something you said. So I think you have already some principles in you, even though things keep changing. There are some fundamentals in there, and I don't know for sure, but I can feel it. Not some. I'll use my intuition to tell us to say that. I can feel that in Joan Walton's mind are principles that govern what trusting the process means, because you know better than I what you're talking about when you say trust the process, and there are particular principles that you have in mind. And that's really what I was trying to. We're going to have to stop in a few minutes, but that's really what I'd like to know is what you mean by trust the process. And that, in the last 5 minutes, maybe you could tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I won't give a definite answer because that brings closure to it. But I think this is why I'm an educator. And you said at the beginning, I want to talk about consciousness education. So a lot of that is about creating the spaces, creating the environment where people can come together and talk about these things. So if I'm in a group and we're saying, that it's important to the universe is a trustworthy place. But what on earth does that mean? Because most people, and there have been many times in my life where I have truly questioned that, been sure it's not true, almost given up. Of course, it's not a trustworthy place. But what I've discovered is over time, despite the suffering, despite the dreadful things that happen, if you stay true to your inner self, which is another concept that we've not spoken about, or the idea of a soul blueprint is something else we've not spoken about. It's very difficult in a podcast to give, you just introduce concepts like this to give snap answers that are, and there's a danger that people just take a phrase you've seen. But the reason for getting engaged in consciousness education is that it allows for people to take their time to start with their own experience, to think about what that means for them, to hear about what it means for other people, to do it. I'm a great believer in bone dialogue. I'm a great believer in listening, being really listening to what other people are saying. I'm a great believer in the silence being as important as the contribution. And that all contributes to a good educational ethos, and that people continue their own journey. Incremental it may be, but they continue on in their own journey. But if we can do that in an inquiry with others, and you're not just doing it on your own all the time, then something greater emerges from that process that wasn't there in any one individual from at the beginning. So perhaps we end where you started, and when you said, I want to talk about consciousness education. What we're seeking to do is to create those kind of opportunities for people to reflect and think about the meaning of this in relation to our own experiences of consciousness, to learn more about the nature of consciousness through that exploration, and to learn about it through sharing their own experiences and hearing of the experiences of others.
Oh, I don't think the way you do, obviously, and maybe I do as well. It's the overlap is there. And when you say soul blueprint, I know what you're talking about. And that's a noun. and that has meaning, that is convertible to each person's experience. Just what it actually is for each person is something else, and the experience of it is something else. But to be able to be in contact, I call it your vibrational signature, that each of us have our own vibrational frequency that's like a fingerprint. And the soul blueprint is something like that, from what I could tell. We have different names for it. But when you get into that state and are able to be in it with some regularity, then you resonate more easily with other people who also can get into that state. So what I imagine happens in your groups is that people start getting closer to their soul blueprint, and that allows them to communicate more authentically with each other. And that's the process that then you begin to continue to trust, because they're all there in their own signature, their own blueprint, and you can trust them, and you can trust what happens as a result of the interaction.
Yeah, truly, truly. And you mentioned the word energy, and we haven't really used that word in this conversation, but it's a very important word, and the kind of energetic level synchrony within the grouping of people rises and can become really very powerful and quite extraordinary to experience.
Well, we're going to stop, Joan, and thanks for that part of it too, because it's it's these last 10 or 15 minutes that I think are so important for other people to get a sense of. It's one thing to talk about coincidences, even the twin ones. It's another thing to talk about the soul blueprint, and to talk about getting into your own vibrational signature and being able to trust what happens as a result of that. And that's what I hear as we end, that you help people do. And that's a process to be trusted.
Thank you, Bernie. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been good.
You're welcome. And so did I. So have I.